Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen out there in internet land, and welcome to the triumphant return of Monday Night Monsters.
Exactly. I didn't know what to do with myself. Last week, in case you folks didn't know, Christopher was gallivanting over merry old England looking for vampires, and I
Was
cannot
indeed.
wait to hear some more of your stories as we go on. But we have a full show, they might say.
See, Pepper and John are here. Hi, guys. Welcome. Excellent. So
And
yes, we
Mary
are going
Beth.
to be discussing the Mary Beth. Hi, nice to have you back. Discussing the extraordinary folklore and heritage and mystery behind probably the most popular monster on Earth is vampires. And we've waited a good while. It's been a couple of months since we started. I think it would have been easy to start with vampires, but we've decided to save them. I wanted to actually have a little bit of time to go and explore England because I've got a really fun vampire story to tell a little bit later on. But yeah, really looking forward to this evening.
Yeah, I think though before we start,
Yeah.
you have to give us a little bit of insight on your trip because I heard a little bit of this, but just your trip to get to Whitby is a bit of a hard tell in and of itself. So why don't you just give us a quick little soundbite about this?
So I'll try and make this brief, but yes. So I arrived in England a little over a week ago, and when I got there, having never been in England before, I had arranged to have a GPS in my rental car, and the GPS ended up dying on me about 2 hours into my trip. And that itself was already a bad sign. But the GPS had sent me about 20 to 25 miles in the wrong direction before it died on me. And so it left me in the middle of basically of English farmland with no idea where I was. And so I had to find my way about a combined 160 some miles by braille. Effectively, I had to touch points, hitting different waypoints along the way, and eventually found my way to the coastal village of Whitby, which features very prominently in the novel Dracula, which was one of my primary destinations while I'm there. Although I do have to warn everybody, we're going to table the talk about Whitby for a future episode, because we're going to do a future episode entirely dedicated to the story of Dracula. Tonight, we're going to be talking a little bit more about vampire folklore all around the world and about how some of that vampire folklore evolved. And I'm going to give you guys a little peek into a remote vampire haunted village that I visited while I was in England.
Yeah. That being said, we better sink our teeth right into it if we're going to get this ball rolling.
Absolutely. So I know that Ron, you've been interested in vampires for a very long time. Anybody who knows me knows that it's a big subject of mine as well. In fact, it's how I got started in this field. I wrote about 25 years ago my very first book, and it was on vampire folklore in New England. And I had grown up absolutely loving vampire stories and Dracula and bats and all the things associated with it. And so I was very lucky to grow up in an area here in the northeast of the U.S. where we have a great deal of vampire folklore. So for me, this is like a homecoming. They used to call me the vampire guy because for a long time I was I was sort of considered the expert. We say every week we're not experts on these things. Well, people have called me an expert on this, so I'm going to try and live up to that reputation as best I can.
Right. And several years ago, I wrote a book entitled On Vampires, which is a historical survey about vampire lores and legend, and was published by Jonathan Downes for the Center for Fortean Zoology out of Devon, England. So so we both have quite a background in the idea of where vampires originated from, and of course, so much of the show deals with the identification of archetypes and how they impact the human imagination around the world, but again, as a kid, it was not Bela Lugosi's Dracula that brought me into the fold. It was the Hammer films, which I absolutely adored the Hammer films, and that's really what made me a great fan of all things vampiric. Then, of course, the Lost Boys.
The Lost Boys, Fright Night, the Hammer
Oh,
Dracula
yeah.
films, all of these great movies from from my youth, when the 1970s and the 1980s was a golden age for horror cinema. I actually threw together a couple of posters for a variety of different vampire films over the last century or so. By the way, congratulations, we have reached 1 century of vampire cinema. This year is the 100th anniversary of the very first major vampire film, which was Nosferatu, made in 1922. Of course, you had Dracula in 1931. Throughout the 80s, you had films like The Lost Boys, Fright Night. Into the 90s, you had Bram Stoker's Dracula, Interview with the Vampire, and more recently, just in the 2000s, Dracula Untold, a kind of a fictionalized origin story of Dracula. And even now, vampires have entered the Marvel superhero universe with Morbius, the living vampire, who I used to read comics of when I was a kid. So they really are, I think, the most iconic of all monsters and have an enormous cinematic presence. And so again, I grew up with it, absolutely fell in love with it. But I think what's going to be interesting tonight is the truth, the real origin and the real history behind vampires is so much different than I think people are going to anticipate. If you haven't really looked too deeply into this, I think you're going to be terribly surprised at how fascinating and how deep the origin of these creatures goes into our sort of collective mythology and into truly ancient civilization.
Yeah, absolutely. Almost the very dawn of humanity.
It
Um,
really
I,
is.
yeah, whenever I was doing my research, I tried to find the earliest account that I could of some sort of blood drinking. I have trained in many parts of many different styles of history, and some in anthropology and some in archaeology. So whenever you go to the library and whenever you start doing your research, you start peeling down the layers and trying to find this great aha moment about when everything kind of happens that you can say this might have been a vampiric activity. And if it's okay, I can go right into the idea, at least my idea of
Absolutely.
the Go Cave incident at Cheddar Gorge in England. Like, again, we're going back to England. So this is right at the end of the last ice age. England at the
It's
time,
about 14,000 BC, give or take, isn't it?
yeah, right around that time, right? So the England would have still been covered with a retreating ice sheet, but it would still be extremely cold Arctic conditions, and the archaeologists at this time, many of them have called England at this time the land of the living dead because there were more people dying there than were being born. People had wandered into this area and it was very hard to get by. So what's so interesting about the Cheddar Gorge is that as this ice age was breaking up, we find that the food was very scarce. So in the Cheddar Gorge, we find the remains of many, many different animals that were brought into this cave and meted out, parceled out for food purposes. So we have things like caribou and reindeer, which is the same, but various different types of deer. And in those piles of bones were also human bones. There was a child and then two adolescents. And they were not shown any deference. They were simply among the midden, among the garbage that was there. And we could tell that they were used for food because there were marks on the bones, right, where the flesh was removed. So we know that there was cannibalism that took place in this cave. But what also is very interesting is there were two goblets that were found that were fashioned out of human skulls right there. And inside those skulls was the residue of human blood. It didn't appear to be of cultic purposes. It didn't seem to be any kind of religious significance behind this. It was simply done for nourishment. Now, of course, human blood has hardly any nutritional value for a human being. We can't even process it very well. But we would not know that, at this time, 12,000, 14,000 years ago, we were just looking for putting something into our stomach. So as a researcher, I find it very interesting that we have a cave which these people emerge because of course these were human beings. They would actually emerge from this cave, go about hunting, and if it would find a human being, it would take them back into that cave and use them for food. So we have this idea of something coming out of the underworld and preying upon the living. And not only that, but caves are also synonymous with bats. So very early on, we have this impression of something coming out of the darkness and preying upon us. And as we will see repeatedly throughout this trek through the history of the vampire, oftentimes the victim is a child, as this case in Cheddar Gorge as well too. Another interesting thing, folks. So for those people out there that like cheddar cheese, this is where cheddar cheese gets its name from. So
Not specifically the cave, but at least the region.
the region, that's right, that's right. Well, they use the cave though actually for the processing of the cheese for cooling.
Oh wow. Okay. So
Yeah,
so
a while
so
back.
I'm gonna have to start reconsidering my my appetite for English cheddar, I think.
There you go. But I also want to put this all into perspective as well too. This is so early in our development, in our diaspora as human beings, that the archaeological evidence in the DNA of the bones suggest that the people in that region, even though this was a very, very cold region, their skin was probably still black and had not become white yet. One of the bodies that were found in Go's cave later on, not part of this particular um, uh, part of this particular killing that we're talking about. These three people that were killed, but they did find somebody in that cave that was dark skinned but had blue eyes, according to the genetics. So we're going very, very ancient, very deeply into our ancient DNA to find out this particular case. So we talk about how things become archetypes. Well, it's something that gives a lasting impression upon who we are. It's some sort of scar within our collective psyche. And I think that this is a good way to start out because something was coming out of a cave and preying upon the living. And that's something that will be reoccurring throughout this talk that we're going to be giving tonight.
And it's fascinating because, of course, this is also a period in early human history when we hadn't begun to develop theological systems. We hadn't begun to develop really anything that qualified as a culture. We were barely more than animals at this point in human history. And so one of my absolute favorite works of art in history is Goya's The Sleep of Reason. The Sleep of Reason produces monsters. And it's the idea that in sort of our nightmares and in our dreams, our innate fears sort of evolve into fantastic forms and become the sort of the grist of the mythology that ends up defining us. And I think that's very much going to be the crux of what we're talking tonight. So you talk about, these people who were living this cannibalistic, feral lifestyle in these caves and feeding on anything, including fellow humans that came within their sort of within their grasp, and how that would have affected the general psyche of other primitive tribes that would have encountered them, that would have lost people to them, that could have been potentially attacked or even seen them in action, and how even that would begin to seep into the consciousness. In our very first episode, we talked about werewolf folklore and the fact that people wearing animal skins and hunting that way, how that would have affected other people that didn't have that tradition and maybe fed into the beliefs that would eventually become what we knew as shapeshifters and werewolves. And these blood drinking feral creatures also living in caves easily could give rise to the idea that they weren't human at all, that they were somehow preternatural.
That's right. It's something out of the underworld, something that exists on a different plane of existence. And as we say all the time as well, history does not exist in a vacuum. Because we have this particular incident in England does not mean it didn't happen throughout the rest of Europe as well too. This
Absolutely.
was a time, as we said, this is a time when we were competing with wolves to live, So we would prey upon anything that would provide us nourishment. We would be caring for our village, and we would do anything that was necessary to do that. And by saying village, that's even a little bit too strong of a word. I guess our clan, our extended family.
It would have been a tribe, a
Right.
nomadic, sort of a gathering. And it is interesting too, because again, saying that this is well before we had developed any kind of a complex moral system, and the idea that anything that was not part of our tribe or our clan would have been considered so other as to not really qualify for whatever we thought our, not that people had an idea of what rights were at that time, but they wouldn't even necessarily have been seen as human. They were completely other. And if you find that difficult to believe, the truth is that all we really have to do is look at even the way our culture is today. It's very easy often for us as people to look someone who lives in a foreign country or across a border and believe that those people somehow are lesser than us. And that's something
Right.
that is still so much prevalent in us today. It's very easy to imagine that primitive man would have had a much more extreme view of that and not necessarily even seen again another tribe as, as a fellow creature, but rather a potential prey. And so it's a terrifying thought, but it does demonstrate just how far we have come from, well, and in some ways, maybe how far we haven't come from the animals that we started out as. We were hardly more than that at that time.
Right. It is that skeleton in our collective human closet that we all have, that we don't like to talk about. But just to piggyback on what you said, I think that's important to point out as well, too, because later on we are going to see whenever vampires intrinsically become attached to the idea of good and evil. But at this time, separated from any kind of religious context, we are dealing with nothing more than the natural world in action. This is at a time whenever it's kill or be killed, and we can see the ruthlessness that's inherent within these kind of images as well too, and you can see how it will become evil. But at the time when there was no kind of moral compass that would point that way, concerning some sort of divine good and some sort of divine evil, this would have been a terrifying existence for a human being. And remember, these are anatomically human beings, same type of mind, everything like that. The same type of things that we can imagine, they could have imagined as well too. So we're not dealing with some sort of proto-human being. We are dealing with human beings that had to live within this kind of world for 100,000 years.
Absolutely. I've always found it fascinating that the base of our brain, when the spine basically enters the skull, that first part of the brain is the amygdala, and the amygdala is the oldest part of our brain. It's the part that has the fight or flight instinct. It's the part that they call it the lizard brain, and they call it the lizard brain because it is the most primitive aspect of our brain. But what's fascinating is that it's still there and still has all of those instincts in it. They just don't dominate us the way they once did because of the way our culture has evolved, and our frontal cortex has become a much more complex thing. It tends to do all the reasoning. But there was a time when the amygdala was still crucially important, and it made all of our decisions for us. Even if we were capable of complex thinking, we still relied on instinct and on that sort of basic primal need. And I think that we see that that was something that was still obviously happening at that point in history. But
Absolutely.
I think
Michelle asked a question. I was trying to sit here. It's rather long. She said a stupid but serious question. That the first records are from 14,000 years ago. They were obviously pictures, not a written language. Yeah. So Michelle, we don't have any kind of language or anything from 14,000 years ago. We do have cave paintings that
correct.
exist, sometimes up to 35,000 years ago. So the cave paintings are quite ancient. But at this particular time, we are dealing with an archaeological record that people are putting together in the 21st century. So we really have no clue of who these people were.
Now, I think we need to do a little bit of a time jump here because
Mm.
this aspect of humanity and its sort of feral nature didn't last forever, and eventually we started to bond together. Tribes started to bond together, occasionally work together. We began at some point to stop being hunter gatherers, to stop moving from place to place and following tribes, and eventually we developed things like agriculture, and we developed sort of social structures. And we did start to develop also an idea that somewhere out there in the universe there were beings, there were creatures, there were sort of forces that were bigger than us, and that they could be appealed to. And the early theology, early religions started to form. And this is, interestingly enough, where some of the first concepts that would eventually evolve into vampirism become. I think the very earliest human civilization or sort of core of civilization is considered to be Mesopotamia, which is effectively the area that centers on modern day Iraq. And I think, what is it, about 25,000 years before, or I'm sorry, 2,500 years or so before Common Era BC, we had the civilizations of Sumer and Akkad. And these were the first great human civilizations, the first true cities where we actually set down roots. We weren't constantly moving around, and these cities expanded and grew. And the first complex theologies actually started to evolve out of these. And I think it's interesting here because this is where we began to see these idea where the gods actually began to reflect the sort of nascent human morality, where we started to have gods that reflected good and gods that reflected evil. And
Right.
one of the, I think, most interesting is the evolution of the goddess figure in this period. Now, there was almost always a perception, and of course, going even back farther than that, of the Earth Mother goddess. But the goddess eventually evolved and broke up. These gods became multiple figures, and the gods started to divide, and they would end up having gods for almost every purpose. And Ereshkigal is one of the earliest human gods, or goddesses in this case, the goddess of the underworld. And what's fascinating about this character is that she was, in effect, a vampiric goddess. This is a goddess who not only was she a goddess of the underworld and controlling the dead, but a goddess with a taste for blood. And this type of thing began to happen again and again as we began to see death as a personified force in human existence.
Yeah, I like the idea, what you had said about. So it was good to start off where we did at this kind of prehistory, whenever the world is all chaotic and everything. So we band together, and then we put up walls, and immediately now it becomes us versus them, right? We are
Yes,
now civilized, and everything that lies outside of those walls. That's the chaos we left, right? That is where we had to struggle for survival. That's where we had to hunt with our hands and everything. That's the place to be feared. But if we're inside these walls, everything is going to be okay. But those fears still linger to the point that we deified those fears
we
in
did.
forms. Yes, yes, yes. So they stayed with us. Even though we became civilized, even though that we left the caves behind us, that fear still lingered to the point that, our gods can now bring death. And because it's a female figure, it can bring life, but it can also bring death as well, just like the natural world.
And what's interesting about this too is that this is the first time that, because the theology started to become complicated, the theology started to weave its way into the ruling classes. Now,
Mm.
when people lived in tribes, there was sometimes a leader of a tribe, but because the groups, these nomadic groups, were so small, there wasn't any kind of a real structure within the tribe, other than really a pack structure like you would see in animals. You would, of course, have the alpha, or the one who made the decisions, and you'd have the betas who did like some of the smaller tasks. But it's still, everyone was roughly equal.
Mm.
When these cities started to grow, when agriculture and these things started to happen, you had to have people who managed the greater needs, and the greater needs ended up resulting in the necessity of some kind of a governing body. But back then, long before the advent of anything that we would ever call democracy, the most reasonable way to achieve governance was with this idea that you had the ear of the gods. And so theology and governance were one and the same. And so as a result of this, you would have priests of individual gods, and a priest,
Mm.
you have the priest of Ereshkigal, you have the priest of Enki, and the priest of Anu, and all of these different gods. And if you had to go to somebody for fertility, you would go to the one who presided over the goddess of fertility. If you wanted to defeat an enemy in an upcoming battle, you would go to the priest who served the god of war. And if you were apparently, I suppose, if you were either in fear of death or fear for your life, or had a loved one who was going to die, you would go to somebody who was the priest who served the god or the goddess of the underworld. And what a fascinating way to govern. And I think that again, this is where we begin to see the evolution of the gods as they slowly divided and became these different entities. And in biblical lore, Babylon, which of course was within this area of the world, was the place where all civilization sort of split off and went their different ways and evolved into different religions. And while that's a very simplified story, the way the Bible tells it, it's not altogether inaccurate, because different groups did split off from these civilizations, but they took their gods with them. And so we start to see the evolution of Ereshkigal, for instance, this death goddess, into various other goddesses who all carried that sort of mark of the undead, basically these goddesses of death. And they, I think, are probably the first true vampires in human history. One that I think that I hadn't thought of in a long time, and when you were sending me some notes about this, is Lamashtu. Lamashtu, this Assyro-Babylonian goddess, who once again, she's considered not merely a goddess, but also a demon. And this is, I think, the point at which we began to start to impose morality on our own gods. And so we would have gods who were gods of good and gods who were gods of evil. And Lamashtu is almost entirely considered to be a god of evil, which was a an important aspect of everyday life. Evil was in people's lives. There was death, there was destruction, there was, anger, there was bloodshed, and so you had to have a deity who oversaw these concepts. And I think she's fascinating because, like so many other gods and deities of that time, she is a creature that is more animal than human. You can see here, this is a modern interpretation. You have the head of a three-eyed wolf, these sort of human claws, the skulls, the flame, the flames of different colors, and the wings. And our gods were not quite as human, not quite as relatable, I think, at that point in history. They were much more these strangely amorphic creatures that were part animal, part human, and sometimes part very, very nebulous concept. You even see this interesting sort of inhumanity in biblical accounts of angels. I think people always sort of make a joke about the idea that we see angels today as these lovely people in white flowing robes with these halos and these wings, but that in the Bible and in ancient mythology, they're described as these things that if you saw one and actually laid eyes on it, you would be terrified. They're almost beyond human comprehension. Rings and eyes and wings and all these kind of crazy things. They're like something out of an H.P. Lovecraft nightmare, honestly.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. So whenever we have civilization, I always like to say at this point we start making the gods in our own image, right? Because that's what we do. We're separated from the natural world, and but as you said too, they become a chimera of different things. They become a chimera of the things that we fear. It's recognizable in somewhat anthropomorphic form, but all the things they personify is that chaos of nature as well too. So they're very difficult to comprehend, and maybe just as difficult to appease as well, because that's the other part of this equation, right? Because we have gods, we have to somehow appease them or to placate them in some way in order to hear our prayers answered. And oftentimes these vampiric goddesses require blood, and
Sacrifice of blood.
oftentimes it is the form of infant sacrifices.
And that's this thing. And again, and I think that's how we came to understand the idea that this hunger for blood wasn't simply a physical hunger, but we began to actually associate the idea of consumption of blood as something that was mystical, something that actually had great power behind it. And this would obviously be something that would carry forward through vampiric belief, even as these gods and these deities evolved into different forms and kind of became what would later become the way that we see vampires today. And I suppose that whereas the 14,000 years ago, with these cave dwellers were monsters to us, but we didn't imagine that they had special powers. We simply saw them as monstrous. But I think we did have to reach a point, probably at this time, especially in the Assyro-Babylonian mythology, where blood itself, as it says in the Bible, the blood is the life. It actually became that force which would sustain and possibly extend life. And that's an interesting transition, because I think we always understood that blood was important, because let's face it, there's got to be, trillions of examples when people saw that a person who bled out would die, but that wouldn't necessarily mean that we saw blood in a mystical way. And I think there does have to be a point where we transferred over to giving blood mystical properties, as these sacrifices would imply.
Yeah, and I think by using children as well too, it's also implied that there's that youth involved, right? That there's something empowered in that blood because it's from somebody that's young.
And it's interesting because I imagine that even at that point in history, we always sort of say, I think, metaphorically, that birth is a miracle, but there's a point in history where birth was considered to be a fairly magical event. The idea of creating a human being from your own loins is something that was an extraordinary power, and it was a power that was obviously only reserved for women, and that gave women a mystical presence that I think, and we're going to get into a little bit later how this has evolved, has always made women slightly terrifying to men. I think that men have this innate fear of the powers of women, and I think that you see this sort of irrational fear of women's magic that actually echoes through so much of patriarchal society, and I think it really does show itself up throughout the evolution of vampire folklore as well.
I think so as well. And it's also interesting if we can, because we can spend a whole episode just on this because I find it so utterly fascinating. So it doesn't take very long within this Babylonian, this Mesopotamian culture to move away from, child sacrifices. It's not that long of a period. I mean, it's a very definite period that lasted for thousands of years, but in the grand scheme of things, it's not that long. But what we have that still sticks with us after we left those times behind is the fear of our children being taken from us by something otherworldly still, right? So where once we sacrificed the children to appease these gods, now we're involved within a culture. We're talking about this is still, 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago. Now we're in a culture where we want to keep our children safe from these things. And now we come to, the Egyptian culture, I think, is really one of those cultures I find so utterly fascinating. So I tried to figure out why children were oftentimes seen as the victim of vampires. And one of the conclusions that I came about is that children often die very suddenly without any kind of cause. We call it, sudden infant death syndrome. But whenever we think about the ancient world, we have a child that could appear healthy one day, and over the next subsequent days, it gradually loses its vigor and eventually passes away. So I was looking into the records, into the medical records, not so much into the archaeological records, and I found out that one of the ways to keep the child healthy is that you have to feed it almost immediately, right? I mean, that's one of the points.
Of course.
So I found in this one really strange a medical text that suggests that in ancient Egypt, to stimulate the child to suckle on the nipple, that garlic was often used to put. So now we have the idea of garlic now to ward off evil. But if we think of that could be the case, that we use garlic and the child was able to feed, and then somebody in the next house down didn't use the garlic and their child eventually died, it does now seem as if garlic is the cure for these types of vampiric creatures. But it was really in Egypt because they have such a pantheon of gods. But we do have this fear of something coming in out of the shadows, out of the desert, and taking the children away from us, to the point that the vampire becomes deified in the Egyptian culture as Sekhmet, this lion-headed goddess. Again, we talked about this earlier, Christopher. We've yet to see a man in that guise, right? We've yet to
Correct.
see a man holding the key to the vampire legend. This is always females, and of course, Sekhmet is often represented as bare-breasted as well too. So we also have this illusion of sexuality inherent within these vampiric females as well.
In fact, it's something that's interesting that a very early goddess, that if we jump back a little bit into again Babylonian myth, is Lilitu, or what we would later come to call Lilith, often referred to as the mother of demons. And so we were working in our sort of ideas about female magic and the mystery of birth into it. And not only was she the woman who supposedly gave birth to the race of demons, but also exclusively fed on either children or expectant mothers. And this is something that actually comes up in other folklore throughout the world over the centuries, these demonic creatures that feed specifically on either children or on women who are pregnant. But Lilitu, or Lilith, is considered sort of the archetype at the core of all of this. And in later history, actually, well after the figure of Lilitu was conceived, she was transformed in the Hebrew tradition into the first wife of Adam. And this is an interesting piece of myth because they as almost every religion evolves, they say that the gods of the religion before become the demons of the new religion. And so Lilitu, they maintained a belief in her. The people had a belief in her, and so the Hebrew, as the Hebrew religion or this Semitic religion began to evolve, they still had these old beliefs, but now she became this monstrous creature. So the idea was that in the Bible there are different versions of Genesis, and depending on how you read it, it does say that that God creates Eve from a rib of Adam, and in that version of Genesis, there's never any reference to a previous wife. But in an earlier portion of the Bible, when referring to the creation of man, it also says God created man and woman, and it suggests that he creates them simultaneously. So this idea evolved that there was a first wife of Adam, and that Lilith and Adam were created from the same earth, both given the same breath of life by God, but with independence. Lilith tried to assert her independence, and that this went against the will of Adam and thereby against the will of God. And so she ended up being cursed, made barren, so she couldn't bear children of her own. And in the ensuing lore, she basically gave into the forces of darkness, becomes this demonic creature, and would steal the children of man because she couldn't have children of her own, and then transform them into her own demon children, often referred to as, I think, the Lilin.
That's
So
right.
it's an incredibly dark piece of legend, but one that evolved out of again, the Assyro-Babylonian concept of Lilith as this goddess figure. And there are some people who actually say that Lilith and this figure, which is I think this is about 7 or 8 thousand years old, this plaque. Some people have questioned its authenticity, but it's generally regarded to be an authentic plaque. May actually have intended to have been a plaque of the goddess Ereshkigal, again, who was the underworld goddess, but later took on the form of Lilith, and then has been sort of deified as Lilith since then. So this isn't simple, and I know we're jumping all over the place because these are complex legends. They're legends that evolve and that don't necessarily stay the same from telling to telling. And I think we said right at the beginning that the origin of how this sort of vampiric concept even entered human consciousness, it's a twisty road, and so you gotta I think you gotta hang on tight and come along for the ride with us on this one.
That's right. But the character of Lilith, especially in Judaic tradition, she was consubstantial with Adam, as you said, made of the same substance. There was no kind of superiority of the man over the woman in this regard, and she would not have it in any other way. If everybody can remember I guess it was the early '90s, correct? The Lilith Fair. Do you remember the Lilith Fair? It
Indeed,
was a
we do.
female-only music festival. No guys allowed. I mean, you could go, but there was no guys that were in bands there. But it was an empowerment to people to think that we're going to use the character of Lilith as being this symbol of us rallying against the patriarchal system. And I think that that's one of the reasons why she has become demonized, is because that is a huge
Literally.
fear. Exactly. Especially in an agricultural society with a woman trying to take the position as at least co-head of the family, that's not going to go very well. So then we have her in this tradition of being exiled from the garden. And according to traditions, as you said, she either runs into the devil himself, the fallen angel who tried to tempt Eve at the apple tree, or into some other fallen spirit, and then that's, like you said, wherever she produces. They're going to now have their plan now is to I guess subvert the children of Adam and Eve, correct, or prey upon them, as you said. But now, yeah, it becomes frightening now, right? And now at this point in history, we have the idea of good and evil coming into the vampiric legend.
And you start to have these myths that get built upon and get elaborated upon. People hear the base of these myths, and they start to invent stories that go along with them. And all of a sudden, you have narratives that define who these people are, what their goals are, and that's how myths evolve. And so Lilith becomes a very complex character, where in the initially as a sort of the goddess Lilitu, a fairly simple character evolved from earlier forms, but now is this complex spurned wife character, and who specifically seeks to do harm and basically subjugate humanity, and sort of found this empire of evil. And I do think it's interesting that although the character of Lilith, Lilitu, and these other underworld goddesses that she was spawned from are not ever truly positive characters, their demonization, again, literally, is still a sort of an outpouring, or it's an outcome of this inherent fear of female power. And again, it's like last time on here, folks. I know we're going a little bit woke, but hopefully we got some folks on that train with us. But because of that, I think that it's fascinating that so many of these traditionally evil or dark characters have been the subject of reclaiming, where a marginalized group of people says that this character is sort of an archetype of the way we have been forced into subjugation, we have been oppressed, or we have been othered, and use that name, use that image in order to sort of to reclaim a certain idea. So the idea is that Lilith was never meant to be evil. She was forced into this sort of life of darkness, and by reclaiming her name, you sort of reclaim that character. I do think that that's fascinating, and it still happens. It happens frequently, even today, in a lot of our modern mythology. Look how many films have been made in the last few years that have taken archetypical fairy tale characters like Maleficent and turned them into heroic characters and told the story of their fall. I think it is fascinating that we do sort of sometimes identify with the villain, because sometimes the villain is just a person who's fallen on hard times, or been a victim of tragedy. So that's a really recurrent theme, I think, throughout most of human culture.
Right. I do want to point out, though, because there's still a little bit of personification inherent within the character of Lilith as well, too, because as we can see in that one frieze that you've shown, that her attributes are now these screech owls. So we have the idea that these are creatures of the night. Something that will be found in our modern vampire mythology. So we see the owls that are on each side. She's also
And
a
she
creature.
herself has the talons of an owl.
Sure, and she's a creature of the wastelands as well, too. We might have to point out that she does not belong within our culture. She resides outside of our civilized walls, and whenever she sneaks in, that is bringing the chaos and the preying upon of the natural world inside the walls, where that should never take place anymore. So we still have that idea that we have to keep the other out, and that's something that's still with us now in vampire lore and culture, because oftentimes the vampire has to be invited inside the house, doesn't it?
It does. Now, it's interesting to note that as culture moved forward from this point now, that, as I said earlier, the gods of the old religion become the demons of the new. But the other thing that often happens as religions evolve and new religions start to flourish is that the old gods, if they aren't specifically given sort of a adversary role, they often get downgraded. And this is an interesting thing, where they become, they still exist in the public consciousness, but people downgrade them. Instead of becoming deities, they become minor spirits, or they become demigods, or they become these other smaller creatures. And I think that, you had pointed out that Lilith is also in, Islamic mythology, believed to be the mother of the jinn, or the jinn, who are these spiritual creatures, much like the way we in the West see demons, who have mystical powers but are much lower on the scale. These are, and the word jinn, of course, being the origin of what we call a genie, these mystical, sort of mischievous and unpredictable spirits that are said to grant wishes in the Arabian Nights. But it's interesting to me that this is a definite downgrade from being a god to being just sort of a trickster spirit or a malicious spirit.
Mhm. Oh no, I agree 100%. Also, it's at this time in both Judaic culture and Islamic culture. Although, of course, we're talking about a few thousand years difference here. But we also see the idea of talismans being produced to keep Lilith at bay. If she would enter the home in spirit form, that was a great way to have your marriage crumble or your children to die or what have you. So long before the crucifix would ward off the vampire, we do indeed have these talismans that are being produced to keep Lilith at bay. So I believe it's Pennsylvania University, the Ivy League one, that has some of these great displays of these Lilith talismans, which basically look like a dinner plate that have these magical writings written around them. But you would place that in your home or preferably above your baby's crib as well too, to keep these kind of beings at bay.
And it's interesting because this is a point in human history where everyday magic became a fairly common thing where people would do small rituals around the home. They would speak charms before they did things, and basically this everyday magic started to permeate life.
Right.
There was certainly an era in human history where we didn't do things like that. We may have grand rituals for the full moon or for a hunt or something like that, but this common everyday magic that would take place in the house, and the idea that these talismans, these amulets that you could acquire or have blessed by your local high priest would actually have power to be able to protect your house. So we started to incorporate magic into almost every aspect of our lives at that time. And we lived in a world that we thought was absolutely surrounded by spirits and surrounded by creatures of the supernatural. And this is the point where creatures like the Jinn and many of these other spirits began to be something that we were trying to protect ourselves against. We still feared the dark. We were still a very primitive people. And, it's funny. We live in a world with electric light. And so we don't understand what darkness is. This is a fact. We just don't understand, because even on the darkest night, there's lights in the distance. There's a street light down the road, or there's a football field in the neighboring town that's lighting up the sky. So unless it's a cloudy night or a new moon and there's a power outage, we don't know what darkness is. And
Right.
it's fascinating to think that these people lived with complete and utter darkness for half of every day. And they couldn't afford to be burning candles and oil lamps literally all throughout the night. So when somebody woke up in the middle of the night and they needed to go take a tinkle, or they wanted to go get a drink of water, they were waking up to a world of pitch blackness. And that is terrifying.
That's
And
right.
so this fear of darkness bred, it's just like I said right at the beginning, the sleep of reason produces monsters. We thought that every possible dreadful thing from our nightmares truly existed and was out there in the darkness, waiting to swoop down from the sky and carry us away. And that evolved into some pretty terrifying creatures in folklore, many of whom were evolutions of creatures like Lilith. The Lamia and Empusa, both these Eastern spiritually originated creatures, blood drinkers, killers, creatures that were, you see with the Lamia here, half a snake being. They were often, again, a fusion, a chimera, a fusion of human characteristics and of animal characteristics. Again, not uncommon that they be female characters, in keeping with what we were talking about earlier. This sense that of the mystery of female magic meant that these creatures were frequently seen as female entities. And we believed truly that they were out there. That's what these amulets were here to protect us for. But many of these creatures, again, were vampiric. We believed that they didn't want to snatch us away, just to enslave us or anything. They wanted to feed upon us. And
That's right.
these creatures, they were so similar to humans, but that were there to feed on us and drain us of our very life force, became a crucial part of that sort of folkloric belief system.
Absolutely. Now, I do want to point out that oftentimes we see these creatures as represented to be snake form as well. So when we talk
Yes.
about the idea of the Garden of Eden with the snake, I think that probably draws from these traditions. Absolutely. Although these traditions predate the writing of Genesis by thousands of years, but you can at least see where the true Genesis had come about the idea of this temptress the tempter into the Garden of Eden. But it comes full circle. But the Impusa, I do want to point out something as well, is that these are creatures that feed upon men and children, not so much women. These were the things of men's nightmares, that they would come and feed upon them. And often they would have this kind of succubus aspect as well. It would continually come to you and draw your energy. So think about it. So a man, lying in bed at night, completely, nude, is being fed upon by a female spirit, and he can do nothing to stop it.
And this actually,
yep.
And this is something that often when a man in the throes of an erotic dream has a release and would be made to feel sinful about this, because this is an era when, again, theology was evolving to a point where sexuality was becoming very moralized, and ideas about taboos against sexuality became more and more prevalent. And so they were told that it was a sinful thing to have these erotic dreams. And so the legend, this succubus character, this idea of a demon that actually came to you and used sexuality to literally draw the life out of you, was a way to scare people into, I would imagine, having morally pure dreams. Not that I think that you can accomplish that. In all of history, I don't think any man has ever gotten through more than a few nights without an impure dream. But this is a point where a little equality of the sexes did begin to trickle in, because they came up with the idea of the incubus as well. The incubus being the male spirit that frequently attacked women, or sometimes these creatures were interchangeable and simply took on the form of the object of sexual desire of their target, of their victim. But I do think, historically speaking, we're getting really, really close to the first recognizable vampires. And up until now, we've been talking about some fairly esoteric concept, and these goddesses and gods of death, and these different sort of very inhuman creatures. But now we're starting to see creatures that look fairly human, and their entire purpose is to swoop down out of the night and literally drain the life from us. The only thing that's missing at this point is that they're not fully human. So we haven't quite gotten to the vampire yet, but we're pretty far along that road.
Yeah, we had said that this was going to be quite a journey, and already it is. So I guess we should tell everybody that this is setting up for part 2 of this, because this is impossible to cover this kind of information in one evening. But I hope I'm having a blast, because this is a fascinating look at something that we had talked about earlier that we hold very near and dear to our hearts. And I don't think that people understand how rooted in a very ancient tradition this absolutely is.
It really is. And again, yeah, so we talked about this a little bit before the show, and then we were sort of looking at our timeline of some of the subjects we wanted to hit, and we thought there's just no chance we were going to get through everything tonight. As a matter of fact, we're barely escaping antiquity here. We still have the Victorian era and sort of the medieval eras and things to cover on this. So yes, we are in fact going to extend this as our first official 2-part episode, and next week delve into some of the more modern interpretations of the vampire, and how, in fact, the vampire went from being this mystical, almost intangible creature of nightmare and ended up becoming something that inhabited our local graveyards, and where it goes from there. So before we start to wrap up for the night, because we still have a few minutes left,
sure.
I'd love to hear what kind of questions you folks do have about where we've gone so far. There've been a couple folks who've chimed in so far, but if anybody has any, because Jeff says, what could the deities from the past be responsible for our written view of angels now? I would certainly think yes. I mean, absolutely, that kind of folklore evolves. I think that wings, we tend to associate wings with deity in general, with things in the heavens. The fact is that as human beings, I think that we envy flight more than almost any other animal characteristic, and we have sought flight since almost the beginning of human history. I mean, look at the legend of Icarus, who built wings of wax and of course flew too close to the sun and ended up being the end of him. But yes, absolutely, I believe that the wings on many of these ancient deities that go back, tens of thousands of years, probably contributed to the way we see angels today. And biblical angels are described as having wings, often 6 or 8 wings, and then like rings of spinning eyes, and they're not really anything you'd want to see in a dark alley. But yeah, even still, I think you're absolutely right on that.
Yeah, yeah. Even the Sphinx was often represented in early Mesopotamia, because we often think of the Sphinx as something being totally Egyptian, which is definitely not the case. But oftentimes we see the Sphinx as having wings as well too. In iconography, from an artistic perspective, wings show that this being that's represented can transcend different states. It can go to the realm of the gods, the ether, if you will. It can also come to our level as well. So wings do have very, very many different meanings when we talk about this, but there is an iconography to it as well.
And Michelle was also just asking where bats come into the picture, and so what I'm going to tell you on that is that bats we're gonna actually cover them a little bit more in the second part of this, because bats have a really important impact in the later Victorian era. But where they come into it, I think, is that we have always found bats to be frightening. It's a human, just the way we find spiders frightening and rats and things like that. Small flitting things that hide in the dark and that could potentially bite us have always been frightening to us. And so there's always been, for definitely since early human civilization, this innate distrust of bats, which is a shame, because the truth is, as far as animals go, they're one of the most remarkable species on the planet. And I'm a huge fan of bats, not just for spooky reasons, but because they're incredibly important, environmentally impactful animals, and generally speaking, harmless. But you do find that going back a very, very long time, that bat wings appear on a lot of demonic depictions of creatures dating back to fairly early human antiquity. So I think as the evolution of the vampire moved forward from these demons and these spirits into the more human vampires, I think it was a fairly easy transition. Bats come out at night. They're frequently hiding in corners, come out with these strange wings that look like hands covered in skin. They're not like any birds that we understood. And so we never completely understood what they were. They looked demonic. They looked evil. So I think it was easy to demonize and to vilify bats, but it really didn't lock in as a vampire specific trope until the late Victorian era. And we're going to cover specifically how that happened in our second episode.
Right. I also have to point out, though, since the Paleolithic, caves have constantly been used as burial places, and bats are synonymous with the idea of caves. So people burying their dead there would always come into contact with bats as well. So I think that we have that as part of our collective unconscious that we bring to this scenario as well, whether we realize it or not.
All right. So, folks, we're going to start to close up shop right now. But before we go, a couple of things. First of all, I know Ron has a little something he wants to talk about. He's got an event coming up, and so I'm going to throw something up on the screen here for you.
I do. So, we talked about werewolves our very first episode, so August the 13th in Paris, Tennessee, I will be involved in the first annual Dogman Cryptid Conference. And I will tell you, the tickets went on sale yesterday. The VIP tickets were gone in 2 hours. The last that I've heard, there were 300 tickets left, and that was within about 8 hours after they went on sale. So if you want to see me down there in beautiful Paris, Tennessee, right around Land Between the Lakes, where there is a lot of supposed werewolf activity going on, I will be lecturing on the mound builders' representation of the dogmen within their culture. So if you guys are going to be around there, come on out or make a vacation of it. Hey, why spend your time at Disney World whenever you can be in beautiful downtown Paris, Tennessee with Ron Murphy
Very
on
good.
August 13th.
And one quick plug for me before we
Sure.
log off for this evening. If anybody's interested in some of my vampire research over the last couple of years, including my pursuit of the vampire Dracula, the Lord of Vampires, this fall I'll be publishing the book Hunting Dracula with an exclusive cover illustration by comic book artist Mike Mignola, who's best known probably for Hellboy. But you can pre-order the limited hardcover of Hunting Dracula exclusively from my website at ghostboypress.com. If you do pre-order the hardcover, this is going to be a signed limited edition, only 100 copies available. So please feel free to pop by ghostboypress.com and put in that order, and those will be shipping in September of this year. So once again, ladies and gentlemen, we are always thrilled to have you guys with us. Please come back and see us next Monday when we will be doing part 2 of our in-depth exploration of the legend of the vampire. And until that time, I'm signing off. Ron and I will be back here next week, and have a wonderful and spooky evening.
Night, folks.